Several years ago, I was on vacation in Marrakesh with my daughter. She was about 4 at the time, and we decided to take a tour through the souk. At one point, we climbed into a small horse drawn carriage, and just before we stepped out, our guide handed me a bouquet of fresh mint. And I remember thinking, this is lovely, but also, what is happening? And then we stepped into the tannery. Now, tanneries in Morocco are extraordinary. This is a centuries old craft. It is deeply embedded in their culture, the skill, the labor, the history behind it. It is all genuinely remarkable. And I want to be very clear, that was not the problem. The problem was that I was wildly unprepared for the sensory experience. Because the second we stepped in, the smell hit me like a freight train. And I have to tell you, I have a wicked gag reflex. Like elite level, my dentist has stories. So within seconds, my brain made a very clear, very, very confident decision. We are not doing this. There was no analysis, no reasoning, no thoughtful consideration of cultural context or historical significance. Just absolutely not. It was a full system shutdown, lights out, we're done here. I was one breath away from fully dissociating in a Moroccan tannery, except I had the mint. And here's the thing. I also had a 4-year-old with me, which meant that I was very generously expected to share. Friends, I did not want to share. But I did what any rational person, what any rational parent would do in that situation. I split the mint, gave her enough to be a good parent, and then buried my face in the rest of it and walked the entire tannery in a very minty haze. Not because it made the smell go away entirely, but because it gave my brain something else to hold on to, something that let me stay just functional enough to keep moving, keep looking, and not completely tap out. And suddenly, I could focus again. Welcome to the Unknown Knowns, where intuition meets tradecraft. I'm Dr. Angela Lewis, and this is a space for people who think for a living. Intelligence professionals, leaders, and decision makers navigating complexity, uncertainty, and imperfect information in a fast-paced world. Each week, we'll explore how intuition, bias, and judgment shape the way we make sense of complexity and how to get better at it. Today's episode is about resilience. Not the kind where you just power through, but the kind that keeps you thinking when your brain wants to tap out. That moment in the Moroccan tannery has stayed with me. Not because of the tannery itself, but because of what it reveals about how our brains operate under stress. Because that reaction, that wasn't about Morocco, which incidentally is one of the coolest places I've been. That was about overload. When we're overwhelmed, whether it's sensory overload, cognitive overload, or emotional stress, our brains don't necessarily rise to the occasion. They simplify. They narrow. They look for the fastest path to safety. In my case, that looked like smell equals threat equals exit. But here's the thing. Leaders and analysts experience versions of this all the time. Not with tanneries, but with incomplete information, time pressure, high-stakes decisions, environments where everything feels urgent and consequential, and sometimes life or death. And exposure to difficult, often disturbing content, terrorism, human trafficking, war, violence, where the stakes aren't abstract but deeply human. And in those moments, the brain does the same thing. It doesn't carefully weigh every variable. It often defaults. We often talk about decision-making as if it's purely cognitive, like if we just had better frameworks or more information, we'd make better choices. But that tannery moment is a reminder that before we can reason, we have to be able to function, and functioning requires regulation. I couldn't think my way through that experience until I had something that stabilized my system. The mint didn't remove the problem, it made it manageable. And that's the idea I want to explore today. Because in intelligence, in leadership, in any high-pressure environment, resilience isn't about being unbothered. It's about knowing what your version of mint is, what allows you to stay present, engaged, and keep thinking even when your brain is telling you to walk away or to tap out. So let's talk about what stress actually does to our thinking, why our instincts under pressure aren't always reliable, and most importantly, how we build systems that allow us to keep exercising judgment when it matters most. There's a concept I come back to often, originally attributed to the Greek poet Archilochus, and more recently popularized in modern habit and performance research by James Clear, author of the bestseller Atomic Habits. We don't rise to the level of our expectations, but fall to the level of our training. And that concept is especially powerful in high-pressure environments, because in those moments, you don't suddenly become more thoughtful or more disciplined. You default to whatever structure is already in place. And if you don't have one, your brain will build one for you. It just might not be the one you want. I see this play out all the time when I watch my daughter play college tennis. And I'll admit, I'm a super proud mom here. She's worked incredibly hard, and when she's in control of a match, when she's executing her game, playing her patterns, dictating pace, you can see it. It's smooth, it's deliberate, it looks almost effortless. And as a parent, you can feel it too, because I know exactly what she's capable of when she's in her groove and playing her game. That's not just talent in the moment. That's all of her preparation showing up. But the real test isn't when everything is going according to plan. It's what happens when her opponent does something unexpected. A different pace, a different style, a shot she didn't anticipate, something that disrupts her rhythm. And in that moment, you can almost see the shift. What does she fall back on? Does she have a mental model that helps her adjust, a way to reset and re-engage? Or does everything start to unravel? If you're familiar with the sport, you know that it's not just physical, it's cognitive. It's a game of angles and inches and strategy, and it's very hard to calculate all of that while sprinting back and forth across the court, all while someone else is actively trying to make you miss. And mid-match, my daughter is not just absorbing disruption, she's also trying to create it. She's trying to read her opponent, anticipate patterns, introduce variation, get ahead of the point instead of reacting to it. And all of that is not so different from what leaders and analysts are trying to do every day. We're not just responding to complexity, we're trying to get ahead of it, to anticipate shifts, to shape outcomes, to stay one step ahead of the problem. And that's not just skill, but also whether there's structure underneath that can absorb disruption and generate it when it matters. And that's exactly what stress does to us in professional environments. It introduces the unexpected. And then it reveals whether we have something to fall back on or whether we're reacting in real time without a net. When we talk about resilience, we often default to a very particular image. It's the person who pushes through, who powers on, who doesn't get rattled. And to be fair, that idea has been shaped in part by some really important work, like Angela Duckworth and her research on grit. Duckworth defines grit as the combination of passion and perseverance for long-term goals, the ability to stay committed to something over time, even when it's difficult, even when progress is slow. And that matters because in many domains, sustained effort, sticking with something when it's hard, is absolutely a predictor of success. It's what keeps people in the game long enough to get better, to build expertise, to achieve things that don't happen overnight. But here's where I think we need to be a little bit more precise, or maybe a little bit more nuanced. Because what I experienced in that tannery was not a lack of grit. I wasn't unwilling to persevere. I was unable to function, at least initially. And that's a different problem. Grit is about staying the course over time. Resilience, especially in high-pressure, real-time environments, is partially about grit, but it's also about something else. It's about your ability to stay cognitively online when your system is under strain. Because if your brain has already decided this is a threat, you don't get to just override that with sheer willpower. In fact, trying to push through in those moments often backfires. You'll get tunnel vision, reactive thinking, overconfidence in early judgments, or just complete disengagement, which, if you're an analyst or a leader, is exactly what you don't want. And this is where I think resilience gets a little bit more interesting, because we often talk about it as if it lives in separate places. The individual needs to be resilient, the team needs to be resilient, the organization needs to be resilient. But in practice, those aren't distinct categories. They're interconnected expressions of the same system. Because yes, people experience stress, but organizations do too. They experience it through strained systems, overloaded processes, compressed timelines, and decisions that have to be made faster than the system itself is designed to handle. So resilience isn't something that exists at one level or another. It's something that shows up across levels at the same time. Individuals rely on systems and routines in order to stay grounded. Teams rely on shared norms to navigate pressure together. Organizations rely on processes and structures to absorb disruption. And those same elements, systems, norms, and structures, operate at every level, not separately, but in interaction with each other. Which means that resilience isn't just about having strong individuals or well-designed organizations. It's about alignment. Do the systems support the people using them? Do the norms reinforce good judgment under pressure? Do the structures help absorb stress or amplify it? Because when those things are aligned, resilience scales, and when they're not, stress does. So the question becomes not whether we experience stress, but what do we have in place when we do experience stress? So in the tannery, grit wouldn't have meant simply standing there and forcing myself to endure it. And to be fair, that's not really what grit is. Grit, as Angela Duckworth describes it, is about sustained commitment over time, about continuing to show up, to work, to adapt, even when something is difficult. It's not blind endurance, it's directed effort. But the challenge I was facing in the moment wasn't about long-term perseverance. It was that I couldn't function in the moment at all. And no amount of willpower was going to solve that. What worked instead was regulation. The mint gave me just enough distance from the immediate sensory overload that I could re-engage with the environment. Not perfectly, but effectively. Because in high-pressure environments, the problem isn't always whether you're willing to stick with something over time. It's whether you can stay cognitively present in the moment long enough to make good decisions. And those aren't really the same skill. So when we talk about resilience in this context, I think a more useful definition is this. Resilience is the ability to restore and sustain functional judgment under stress, not the absence of reaction and not the suppression of instinct, and not the same as perseverance over time, but the capacity to say, I can feel my system reacting and I still have a way to stay engaged. As I mentioned earlier, resilience isn't about being unbothered. It's about identifying what allows you to stay present, stay engaged, and keep thinking even when your brain is telling you to tap out. If grit helps you to stay committed to the goal over time, resilience is what allows you to keep thinking clearly in the moment, especially when your system is under strain. They both matter because you can be deeply committed, highly motivated, and still struggle to function effectively when the pressure spikes. And this is where it becomes directly relevant to intelligence and leadership, because the environments we operate in are often ambiguous, high stakes, time-constrained, and emotionally charged in ways we don't always acknowledge. And sometimes they involve exposure to difficult, deeply human realities, violence, instability, suffering, that add another layer of cognitive and emotional load. Under those conditions, the risk isn't just that we'll get the analysis wrong, it's that we'll stop thinking well altogether. We'll anchor too quickly, we'll fixate on the most salient threat, and critically, we'll move toward premature closure. Richard Hewer explicitly applies this idea to intelligence analysis, the tendency to accept an explanation before it's been fully vetted, often because uncertainty is uncomfortable and time pressure pushes us toward closure. And that connects closely to what Daniel Kahneman describes as cognitive ease, that sense that something is clear, coherent, familiar, and therefore more readily accepted. Under stress, that ease can feel like understanding. It can feel like certainty. But sometimes what we are actually experiencing is not clarity at all. It's simply relief. The relief of arriving at an answer that is easier to hold than the complexity that we were facing. In other words, we don't always choose the best answer. Sometimes we choose the answer that allows us to stop thinking. We collapse complexity into something that just feels manageable. In high-pressure environments, that feels like clarity, but it's actually the seductive relief of an answer that lets us stop wrestling with uncertainty. It's the absence of friction, not the presence of understanding. And this doesn't happen because we lack skill, but because our system is overloaded. And when that happens, it's not just an issue at the individual level. It can be a system-wide signal. In other words, the quality of judgment at every level is directly tied to whether resilience, real functional resilience, is present in the system. Which brings us back to the idea of the mint. Because if resilience is about staying cognitively online under stress, then the real question is not whether we get overwhelmed, because we will. The question is, what helps us recover enough to keep thinking? What are the mechanisms, individual, team, and organizational, that create just enough space between stimulus and response for judgment to re-enter the room? That is where real resilience lives, not in gritting your teeth, not in pretending you're unbothered, but in building the capacity to stay in the problem without being consumed by it. So if resilience isn't about pushing harder, but about staying cognitively online, then the question becomes, what are the tools that actually make that possible? What are our versions of the mint? And I think it helps to think about these in 3 categories: physiological, cognitive, and structural. So the first level is the most basic and maybe the least glamorous, but it makes a difference. Before you can think clearly, your system has to be stable enough to support thinking. That might look like slowing your breathing, stepping away from the immediate environment, changing your sensory input, taking a short pause to let your body catch up with your brain. Because when your body is in a stress response, your brain is not prioritizing nuance. It's prioritizing speed, safety, and escape. And sometimes what you need is something simpler, something that interrupts the loop entirely. In our house, we call this getting booped. I use this with my daughter when she's playing tennis. I can see when she's starting to get inside her own head, when the frustration's building, when she's no longer in control and just reacting, when everything starts to spiral just a little. And in those moments, she doesn't need more coaching. She just needs a reset. Now, this is going to sound like peak dorky parent behavior, but at 18 years in, I've fully embraced it, and she knows exactly what I'm doing. So last week, mid-match, I leaned over just enough so only she could hear me and said, "What do you call a fish with no eyes?" And she looked at me, already grinning, already knowing exactly what's coming, and with a laugh and a tiny eye roll, goes, "Psh." She knew exactly what I was doing, and she also knew that she needed it. That's the boop. Now, booping is not a formal psychological term, but the mechanisms behind it are well understood. It's a form of pattern interruption, breaking a cognitive or emotional loop that is starting to run on autopilot. It's attentional shifting. It's redirecting focus away from the stressor, even briefly. And humor, in particular, is incredibly effective here because it does 2 things at once. It disrupts the current thought pattern, and it introduces a small positive emotional shift, just enough to reset the system. Now, the goal here isn't distraction for distraction's sake. You still have to refocus after the boop. But humor has been shown to reduce physiological stress responses, lower cortisol levels, and increase cognitive flexibility, meaning it actually helps the brain become more adaptable in the moment, which makes it more than a personality trait. It's a tool. And honestly, intelligence professionals are some of the most quietly witty people I know. That dry, understated humor, that perfectly timed aside, that's not just personality. That's a potential superpower. Not to be used inappropriately, of course, and not to minimize serious issues. There is a time and a place, but those times and places are probably more plentiful than we realize. Humor can be used to create just enough space to reset thinking when we really need it. It's the same principle as the mint in the tannery. You're not removing the stressor, you're making it manageable. Because sometimes the most effective thing that you can do is to create just enough distance, physically, physiologically, or cognitively, to interrupt the loop. Not forever, and certainly not as avoidance, but as a quick reset. And if you zoom out, this is also what good leadership looks like under pressure. Not necessarily telling a joke in the middle of a crisis, but recognizing when a team is spiraling, when thinking is narrowing, when stress is taking over, and creating just enough space for people to reset. Now, sometimes that's a well-timed question. Sometimes it's a pause. Sometimes it's shifting the tone of the conversation or the approach you're taking. And sometimes it's humor. But the function is the same: to interrupt the loop, restore perspective, and then bring people back online so that they can think again. And in that sense, sometimes the difference between reacting and thinking is just a well-timed boop. Now, the next level is cognitive. Once your system is regulated enough, the next step is to reopen that problem space. This is where you build in cognitive systems to reintroduce structure and perspective. Because as we've discussed, stress narrows your thinking. It pulls you towards first explanations, focusing on the most obvious threats, sticking with the simplest narratives, and defaulting to answers that feel right mainly because they reduce the discomfort of not knowing. So this is where cognitive tools come in: structured analytic techniques, deliberate framing, actively asking what else could be true. This isn't an academic exercise, but rather a way to actively resist premature closure. Because under pressure, your brain is not just trying to be right, it's trying to be done. And that's where concepts like cognitive ease, described by Daniel Kahneman, come into play. We are naturally drawn to explanations that feel coherent, familiar, and easy to process, especially when we're tired, overloaded, or under stress. So, part of cognitive resilience is deliberately introducing just enough friction back into your thinking to sharpen it. The goal isn't to make your life more difficult, but to make your thinking more accurate. And though it can be challenging, one of the most powerful tools here is intentional perspective taking, especially when a topic is emotionally loaded. Because those are the moments when your brain is most convinced it already understands the situation, or is most tempted to accept a narrative that feels obvious when alternative views feel unnecessary or even threatening. And that's precisely when you need it the most. Stepping back, considering alternative viewpoints, asking how someone else, an adversary, a stakeholder, a decision maker, might interpret the same information differently. And yes, it can feel uncomfortable because you're moving out of cognitive ease and back into cognitive strain. But that discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It's often a signal that you're thinking again, that you're reopening the problem instead of closing it off too early, that you're choosing to sit in that discomfort to ensure your judgment is reasoned and not just relief. Now, the third level is structural, where you build systems that support you. This is recognizing that resilience should not depend entirely on individual effort. We need to build structures to support judgment, team norms that encourage challenge and dissent, processes that slow decision tempo when needed, routines that create clarity before pressure spikes, and tools, yes, including AI, that help us process information without becoming overwhelmed by it. Because under pressure, you don't rise to the moment, you fall to the systems around you. Now, I'll probably do an entire episode on systems theory at some point because systems thinking is a much bigger topic. But at a practical level, when I say systems here, I don't just mean habits. I mean an entire environment that shapes how thinking happens under pressure. That includes your habits or routines, but also your decision-making frameworks, your team dynamics, your information flows, and the expectations, whether explicit or implicit, that guide how people respond when things get difficult. In other words, systems are not just what you do when things are calm, they are what shows up when things are not. Good systems don't eliminate necessary stress, but they can reduce unnecessary friction, absorb some of the load, and make good judgment more sustainable. They create guardrails when cognitive bandwidth is low and create space for better thinking when pressure is high. In short, they make it easier to think well, especially when it's hardest to do so. Because resilience isn't just something you have or don't have. It's also something your environment either supports or undermines. And when those systems are aligned with how people actually think and operate under stress, resilience doesn't just exist, it scales. So, what does this actually look like in practice? Because build better systems sounds great, but it's not always obvious where to start. And the good news is this doesn't require a complete overhaul. It's usually a set of small, intentional choices that shape how you and your team operate under pressure. So first, start at the individual level. Build your own reset mechanisms before you need them. What reliably helps you reset when you feel yourself getting overwhelmed? Is it stepping away for 5 minutes, taking a breath and slowing your pace, going for a walk, connecting with a friend, snuggling with a golden retriever? Humor. What is your version of a boop? Whatever it is, the key is to identify it in advance, because in the moment it is unlikely that you will rise to creativity. You'll default to what's already familiar. Second, make reopening the problem a habit. We've talked before about how stress drives premature closure. So you need to build in a counterweight. That can be as simple as asking, what else could be true? Or forcing yourself to generate at least 2 alternative explanations. Or pausing before a decision and truly considering, what are we missing? The goal isn't to slow everything down unnecessarily. It's to create repeatable triggers that re-expand your thinking when it starts to narrow. Third, normalize the pause, individually and as a team. One of the most powerful structural moves is also one of the simplest. Make it acceptable to pause, to say, let's take a step back. I think we're converging too quickly. Can we look at this from another angle? Because in many environments, the pressure is not just to be right, but it's also to be fast. And if speed is the only signal that matters, thinking quality will often degrade. Fourth, build challenge into the system, not just the culture. We often say we want dissent, but unless it's built into how decisions are made, it doesn't reliably show up. So this might look like assigning someone to argue the alternative, using structured techniques like analysis of competing hypotheses, or simply asking what would change our mind and looking for that, not as a formality, but as a safeguard against cognitive ease. Fifth, reduce friction where it doesn't belong. Not all friction is good. You want friction in thinking, but not in process. If your systems create unnecessary confusion, overload people with information, or force decisions without clarity, then they're likely amplifying stress rather than absorbing it. Good systems reduce the noise so that attention can go where it really matters. Sixth, pay attention to the early warning signs. Resilience isn't just about recovery, it's also about recognition. Can you spot when your thinking is narrowing, when frustration is rising, when the team is converging a little too quickly? Because those are moments where a small intervention, a pause, a question, a boop, can have an outsized impact. And it's important to note that none of this is about perfection. It's about having enough in place that when the pressure hits, you don't have to figure it out from scratch. You already have something to fall back on. And that's what makes resilience real. Now, I want to pause here because this is important and it needs to be said. Feeling overwhelmed in high-pressure environments does not make you a bad intelligence professional or a bad leader. It makes you human. In fact, often the people who feel it the most are the ones who care the most. They are the most engaged, the most invested in getting it right. That emotional connection, the sense that the stakes matter, is part of what drives perseverance. It's part of grit. But it also comes with a cost, because sustained exposure to that level of pressure, without the ability to regulate it, can wear you down. It can narrow your thinking over time, reduce your flexibility, make everything feel more urgent than it actually is. So, resilience isn't about eliminating the stress response. It's about recognizing it early and knowing what tools to reach for. Your version of the mint might be stepping away for 5 minutes to regain perspective, deliberately reframing the problem, asking a colleague to challenge your assumptions, or simply creating enough space to think again. Not because the problem has gone away, but because you've made it more manageable. And ultimately, that is the goal. Not to become immune to stress, but to build the capacity to stay in the problem without being overwhelmed by it. Thanks for listening to the Unknown Notes. If this episode made you think or rethink, share it with a colleague or friend who's ready to level up their tradecraft. Subscribe for more short, sharp conversations about the art and science of professional judgment. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep turning intelligence into impact.